It's April 14th, 1912. The ship is unsinkable. Everyone told you so. You paid for your ticket, you found your cabin, and somewhere in the North Atlantic, you're probably asleep. Then at 11:41 p.m., something scrapes against the hull. Not a bang, not an explosion. Just a long grinding shudder that most people slept right through. That sound was your clock starting. You now have 2 hours and 40 minutes before the Titanic disappears beneath the ocean. What you do in those 160 minutes is the difference between life and death, and most people made every wrong choice possible. The first mistake happened before anyone even knew there was a problem. When the iceberg struck, the ship didn't lurch dramatically. There was no alarm blaring through the corridors. Passengers in first class heard a faint grinding and went back to sleep. Some thought another ship had bumped them in the night. A few even ran to the deck thinking it was exciting, a bit of adventure to write home about. But the crew already knew. Below the waterline, 5 compartments were flooding simultaneously. The ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, who was on board, inspected the damage and gave Captain Smith a quiet, devastating verdict. She would sink in under 2 hours. That information never reached most passengers. And the ones who found out early, the ones who moved fast, were the ones who lived. The lifeboat situation was a disaster before anyone even boarded one. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on board. Do that math, and you already understand that surviving the Titanic wasn't just about bravery or luck. It was about timing. The first lifeboat launched at 12:40 a.m., over an hour after the strike. It had a capacity of 65 people. It left with 28. In the early stages, passengers refused to get in. The ship felt stable, the night air was freezing, and climbing into a small wooden boat dangling over the Black Ocean seemed far more dangerous than staying on a lit, warm, enormous vessel. That hesitation filled the water with bodies. If you had gotten to the boat deck within the first hour and pushed your way onto any lifeboat, even half full, you were almost certainly going to survive. The window was real. Most people just didn't know the clock was ticking. Where you slept determined whether you even had a chance to make that window. First-class passengers had cabins on the upper decks, direct access to the boat deck, and stewards who personally knocked on their doors. Third-class passengers were housed near the bottom of the ship behind locked gates in a labyrinth of corridors they'd barely had time to learn. Many of them didn't make it to the top deck until the lifeboats were already gone or nearly full. The survival rate tells the story brutally. About 60% of first-class passengers survived. Around 25% of third class made it out. If you were in third class, survival required something extra, ignoring the crew's instructions to wait, finding unmapped staircases, moving before you were told to. The passengers who lived from the lower decks didn't follow the rules. They found their own way up. If you made it to the boat deck, what you were wearing could still kill you. The water temperature that night was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing, kept liquid only by its salt content. Without a life jacket and proper clothing, a person in that water had between 15 and 45 minutes before hypothermia shut their body down. With a life jacket but no insulation, the timeline wasn't much better. The survivors who went into the water and lived were almost universally the ones who had layered up. Coats, wool clothing, anything that trapped body heat. Some passengers ran to the deck in nightgowns. Some didn't bother grabbing a coat because they assumed they'd be back inside soon. That assumption cost them everything. If you had taken 2 extra minutes to dress properly before leaving your cabin, your odds of surviving the water increased dramatically. 2 minutes. But there were lifeboats that most people never even found. The Titanic carried 4 collapsible lifeboats, collapsibles A, B, C, and D, stored in less obvious locations around the ship. Collapsible D launched just minutes before the final plunge with 44 people. Collapsible C carried 39, including one very controversial passenger, J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, who stepped into a boat while hundreds of women and children were still on board. Collapsibles A and B were still strapped to the roof of the officers' quarters when the ship's forward funnel collapsed. Both washed off the deck as the bow submerged. Collapsible B floated upside down. About 30 people clung to its hull through the night, standing in the freezing dark, shifting their weight to keep it from sinking, until the Carpathia arrived at dawn. Those 30 people made it. If you had known where Collapsible B was, and you had the physical strength and presence of mind to climb onto an overturned boat in the middle of the ocean at 2 a.m., you had a chance. For everyone else, the water was the last option, and it wasn't a death sentence automatically. The common image is that going into the water meant dying. For most, that was true, but not for everyone. Charles Jaugen, the ship's chief baker, reportedly drank a significant amount of whiskey before the ship sank, tread water for hours after the Titanic went under, and was eventually pulled onto Collapsible B, reportedly showing almost no signs of hypothermia. Whether the alcohol genuinely helped or he was simply extraordinarily lucky is still debated. What is documented is that the survivors pulled from the water weren't random. They were the ones who stayed calm, kept moving to maintain circulation, and positioned themselves near debris or overturned boats rather than swimming outward into open ocean. Panic killed as many people as the cold did. And that's where the real survival lesson lives, in the psychology. Studies on mass disaster consistently show that humans in crisis don't panic dramatically the way movies portray. Instead, they freeze. They wait for instructions. They look at what the people around them are doing and mirror it. On the Titanic, when nobody moved toward the lifeboats, most people didn't move toward the lifeboats. When crowds gathered at the stern as the bow sank, moving away from the water, people joined the crowd, even though it was moving them toward the highest point of a ship that was about to go vertical and drag everything near it under. The passengers who survived disproportionately shared one trait. They made independent decisions early, before the crowd's psychology locked in. They didn't wait to be told. They assessed, they moved, and they didn't stop moving. Every way to survive the Titanic comes down to the same brutal formula. Know before others know, move before others move, and never assume that staying still is the safe choice. The ship took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. That is not a short time. It is enough time to reach a lifeboat, enough time to dress properly, enough time to find a collapsible nobody else thought to look for. The people who died weren't weaker or unluckier in some cosmic sense. They were slower. They trusted the system. They waited for someone to tell them how serious it was. The Titanic didn't just sink. It ran the most brutal stress test in human history on how people behave when the unthinkable happens. And the answer it gave us is uncomfortable. Most people don't survive because most people wait. The ones who didn't wait are the ones who live to tell the story.